Hello and welcome to the Red Lion Pub Hub, coming to you from the Red Lion Pub in Chicago, Illinois. I'm your host, Colin Cordwell, and for the immediate stretch of time, I shall be talking to you about ghosts and the supernatural. The stories which I shall be discussing were related to me over the years, or are stories which happen to me personally. How do I feel about ghosts? Well, it's funny. I go back a long way with our friends, and they walk among us. I believe they walk next to us. They walk through us. Sometimes they even sleep next to us. Their umbilical cord to us is the memories of days long gone by. They're addicted to life, the emotions therein. The sudden shift of consciousness from this life to the next was lost in momentary confusion. Life goes on, so they thought. However, a footing was lost on the way to the light that everyone talks about when you pass from this life to the next. Life does go on, but not as they thought. Somehow it is life, but life with an unreal twist. I can see them, says one shade, but they can't see me. They can't hear me either, or so I believed. I have a sort of a friendly collusion with ghosts, since my pub is known for being haunted, and whenever the name the Red Lion Pub comes up, the first thing that comes into people's minds is ghosts. The stories I'm going to relate to you, I have been told by people who are of a very sober nature. I wouldn't call them crazy. I wouldn't call them psychotic. These are people like you and I who get up in the morning, put their clothes on, go to work, come home, and in the interim, these things have happened to them. When I was a little boy, my grandmother told me a couple of ghost stories. I had no idea what the heck a ghost was. They had to explain it to me. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So you can live in two places at the same time, I thought. My English grandfather used to live in a house that was reputedly haunted. There were 14 children in his family, 10 boys, 4 girls, and they were all crowded into one house. I have no idea what other hobbies my great-grandmother had, except bearing children. They had a piano in the downstairs parlor, and late at night, as the story goes, or as the story went, the piano would play. And one night, my grandfather and 2 of his brothers crept downstairs, and they looked around the corner. And what did they see? A luminescent green man sitting on the chair in front of the piano, playing away. They sat and looked at him for a while, until this phantom felt like he was being watched. He turned around, and as he looked at them, he vanished right in front of their eyes. The other story, which was related to me, was of my great-grandfather, who lived in Scotland, and one night there was a knock on the door, and he opened the door, and there was a man standing there in a black cloak, and he wanted to know the directions to the next village. So my great-grandmother offered his services and told him, Angus, go show the man down the road towards the next village. So they were walking down the road, and as they were walking, my great-grandfather heard a clop, clop, clop. And he thought his horse had followed him. And he looked behind him, and he didn't see anything. He looked in front, he didn't see anything. And he saw out of the corner of his eyes, the man was still with him. He looked down, and where the man's feet should have been, there were cloven hooves. My great-grandfather put his hands up to his eyes, rubbed him, and when he took his hands away, the man was gone, and he looked in front, and a fireball was disappearing over the hill. That was one of the family stories, which really piqued my interest in ghosts over the years. And as it happened, when I opened the Red Lion Pub back in the mid-'80s, we happened to have a denizen of that world living in our establishment. The stories, though, I'm going to tell aren't pertinent to the Red Lion Pub. These are stories that people told me when they found out I owned the Red Lion Pub, and they said to me, I can tell you because I know you'll understand. And I've heard this over and over and over again. If I tell other people, they think I'm crazy. It was about 30 years ago. It was a busy Saturday night, and one of my waitresses came up to me and said, I don't know how to tell you this. I spilled salad dressing all over this guy's pants, and I feel so embarrassed. And he was very nice about it, but he wanted to know if he could talk to you. And I said, absolutely. So I went up to the table and I apologized profusely. I said, please give me your address. Send me a dry cleaning bill. He goes, oh, no, I don't care about that. He said, I hear you have a ghost here. I said, yeah. He said, well, my wife and I lived in a haunted house on the south side of Chicago. I said, really? What was the gist of the story? And he said, well, the people who owned the house before had lived there for about 60 years, an elderly couple, and they were getting up in years, and their children wanted to they wanted to have them sell and move into assisted living, but the parents were obstinate. They didn't want to move. They'd known this place for 60 years. And the kids pushed back and forth with them, and eventually the husband died. And shortly after, the wife died. The children sold the house after fixing it up, and he said it was one of two houses that we looked at in the neighborhood, and we decided we liked it. We liked the way it was laid out, and it was a nice place. And it was an older house. It was built in around 1909 or something like that. The first person to see one of them was my wife, he said. She came out onto the porch one day, and there was an old man on the swing chair, just rocking back and forth, looking at something or staring vacantly at something across the street. And she came up and says, excuse me, can I help you, sir? He didn't answer. She goes, can I help you? And he vanished in front of her eyes. But the chair kept swinging back and forth. And there was a sort of clockwork to behavior. He said if you weren't in bed by 11 o'clock, the rocking chair in the front room upstairs would go back and forth, and you would get louder as if it was on a volume control. And if you weren't in bed by midnight, the beveled glass door at the top of the stairs would slam shut. He said that happened one New Year's Eve party when we had some guests over, and we were trying to turn up the stereo so people wouldn't hear it, and the door kept slamming shut upstairs. And among other things, he said we would notice that people would comment on the elderly people who were hanging around outside our house, or they'd see them in the windows. They thought that perhaps I'd brought my parents in. We had a finished attic, and the children in the neighborhood used to love playing in the attic. We'd let them play in the attic, and there was a spacious area, almost like a gymnasium. Yeah, one of the mothers called one day and thanked his mother for having her mother watch the children while they played. She says, what are you talking about? She said, oh yes, a very nice elderly lady told the kids, don't go too close to the windows, don't open it up, that's okay, you play over there, that's fine. And this was about an hour after the kids had been over to the house, so she pulled the ceiling door down and went upstairs, and there was nobody up there. And the gentleman told me one time his brother was over, and they were going to go out and go to a couple of local bars and have a few drinks, but they forgot to go to the bank, so they didn't have any money. And they went into the kitchen, and there was an old purse sitting on the kitchen table, open, and there was an old change purse, and there was old money in it. And as if the ghosts wanted them to go out and have a good time. They were very friendly, sort of loving, protective ghosts. They liked the people who were living in their house, and they had this sort of coexistence with it. Except one time, I don't think they were musically inclined. One time he said he came home and his dog was tearing around all over the house, and someone had taken mustard and poured it all over the piano. So I don't think they were of a musical bent. The man told me they got to a point a few years later where they had to sell the house. He was moving because of a job, and he didn't feel good about talking about prepping for a sale or the sale while they were in the house. And he said, we used to go down to the corner restaurant and plan. My wife and I would plan how we were going to sell the house and who we were going to use. One night, he said, his wife turned to him and said, I'm going to take a bath, but I feel really off. Would you just stay in the hallway? I'm going to leave the bathroom door open. And we can talk or, discuss other stuff, but I don't want to discuss the sale of the house. And he said, fine. So he sat in a chair in the hallway, and they were talking, and she was taking her bath. And when she came out, she met him in the hallway, and she looked at him very funny. And then went to the bedroom, got dressed, and came downstairs. And he said, when they went outside, he said, are you okay? He said, when we were in the hallway, someone was standing behind you, waving at me. And I closed my eyes open again. They were still there. She had forgotten a barrette, and they had to go back into the house, and the house is in complete darkness. And he said the interesting thing is they seem to keep the same frailties in death that they had in life. And he said they went in the house, they turned on the lights as they went in, leading up to the place where they had to get the barrette. And as they turned on the front hall light, they heard someone coming down the stairs. And when they turned on a second light, the footsteps stopped. And then they ran back upstairs, and they heard a door slam. And they went upstairs, and there was no one there. So he said, I appreciate you allowing me to tell me the story, because I feel I can talk to somebody who knows what the heck I'm talking about. I'm not hallucinating. I said, no, I get it completely. Well, the things I've experienced here, I understand it completely. Another story pertains to a haunted hotel which I stayed in England, down the road from my grandmother's house. And it was called the White Horse Inn in Chislehurst, just inside Kent. My grandmother lived about a mile up the road. There wasn't enough room in her flat for all of us to stay, so I would switch off one night. The room was just a box affair with a closet, 2 parallel beds, a large window looking out onto the avenue. It was on the 3rd floor, and there was a dress mirror next to the bed which was closest to the bedroom door. Nothing happened when I stayed there. The next night, my brother shared the room with my sister, and in the morning, they came to my grandmother's flat, and they were very quiet, and my brother was ashen. And my sister said, you're not going to believe it. And I said, what? I said, we were visited by a ghost. I said, please explain. I've got to hear this. She said, well, Ian and I were lying there talking, and we heard somebody walking back and forth down the hallway as if looking for their room. And you could hear the footsteps, and it sounded as if they were lost. And the footsteps stopped outside of the room, and then the footsteps went through our door, and we saw something go past the dress mirror in our peripheral vision. And the footsteps walked to the end of the bed, Ian's bed, and stopped. And then we heard this heavy breathing, which sounded like the crackling of paper. And it lasted for about 3 minutes. And the footsteps went past Ian's bed again, my brother, through the door and down the hallway. And I turned the light on, and Ian was the color of the sheets, and his hair was just about standing up. So they talked to the manager of the hotel that afternoon, and he said indeed there had been a fire there in the 30s, and someone had died on that floor. And every once in a while, if you were attuned, you would be the recipient of their knock-knocks and entering their room. I seem to have missed that episode, but my sister and my brother swore by it, and I believe them. Another story, which I had a personal relation to, involved a friend of mine who passed away. Michael was a very dear man. He was English. He was dying of cancer. He was associated with Second City here in Chicago. Lovely man. He was in his 40s. He contracted liver cancer. And I got to know him really well towards the end of his life. And he would come into the pub. He would eat lightly. He had a younger wife who was about 20 years younger than him. Lovely young woman. And I used to take him to I would pick him up and I would take him to his treatments, his cancer treatments down at the University of Chicago. And I would go visit him at his home. And every once in a while I would take him to my log cabin in Indiana. I had a spread of land out there, out in the woods. And it was one of the few places where he could get a rest and he could sleep. Because he told me the pain was so bad, he would lie in the backyard and watch the moon go across the sky all night, just staring at the moon. And out in Indiana, he could smoke his medicinal marijuana, and we would talk. And I would do work around the thing. I said, you just lie here and relax. And he did. He would sleep. And one time we spoke about it, and I said, Michael, I happen to believe in the hereafter. And he said, I think I do too. I hope there is. I said, you will. What's happening is you're getting rid of something that doesn't work. I said, what are the chances the doctors give you? Oh, about 50-50. He said, I just don't want to be a burden to my wife. I said, you're not a burden to your wife. You're not a burden to anybody. And I talked to him about the survival of human personality after physical death. And he said, I have to believe in that. He left his hat in my car. And a couple of days later, I dropped him off at his house. We drove back to Chicago and dropped him off at his house and said goodbye. A few days later, his wife came in, and I said, oh, by the way, I have Michael's hat. She goes, I know, he passed away last night. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. She said, the funeral is going to be this coming Monday. It was in October, one of the first weeks of October. And it was an enormous Catholic cemetery on the south side of Chicago. And I remember I had to wait about an hour and a half for my business partner at the time to go get our liquor license. And I was late to the service. And she asked me if I could bring the hat to the service. And I said, of course I will. So as soon as my partner came back, I shot down there. And I got there, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was raining. It was miserable. It was a huge cemetery. And I went to the office, and I said, can you tell me where my friend Michael is buried? She goes, yes. Unfortunately, everybody's gone. She said, I don't know what to tell you because your friend was cremated, and they just put his urn into the ground. And it's not marked. And I said, well, I feel I have to try. And she said, well, here's a map, and it's behind this office in the quadrant directly behind us. And the quadrant was about twice the size of Wrigley Field. And it literally was like looking for a needle in a haystack, rather. And I walked around for about half an hour with his hat in one hand and the map in the other. And I'm walking through these tombstones, and it's getting darker, and it started raining. And if it wasn't for the frustration of it, it would have been a very eerie thing. I would have been spooked by it. But I kept walking around for half an hour, 45 minutes. And I finally said, I'm sorry, Mike. I did my best. I'm going to say my prayer, and I have to leave. And I heard his voice behind me at about 4 o'clock. I was facing east, and it was just behind me to the right. I heard him as clear as day say, hey, Colin, mate, I'm over here. And I turned around in the direction where I thought I heard his voice, and I walked through these tombstones, and I got to this little opening, and sure enough, there's a fresh pile of dirt there. The woman in the office said, "You'll know you found it if you see 3 small trees planted in a semicircle 20 feet away." And I looked up, and there were the 3 small trees. I knew he had made his peace, and he had come back to say goodbye. And it was one of the instances where I was absolutely assured in the survival of the soul after physical death. The next story I'm going to relate is one of my favorites. I was in Gibson Steakhouse here in Chicago, one of my favorite restaurants. One evening, I was having a drink with my wife, and a fellow a few feet away heard me talking to someone and said that I own the Red Lion Pub. And he said, "Is that place still haunted?" I said, "Yeah, very much so." He said, "I got a story for you." And this gentleman related the following tale, which he personally took apart. A friend of his, who was a banker, bought a mansion in north central Indiana. And it was situated on an area of land which was a perfect wetlands. And it seemed that every duck and goose flying from Canada or from the south would land here, or quite a few of them would land there, on their way up north or back down south. The mansion was built by one of the original Marshall Fields. And he told me his friend invited him and another friend of theirs who was an accountant out for the weekend. So he made the trek out there. It was about 2 hours from Chicago, and he said it was off on a side road. It was a little bit of a circuitous route to get to the place. And originally there was a train track which would come from the interior all the way out to the road, and a little train would pick up the guests and take them back into the interior to the mansion. They had since paved a road alongside the train track, and the train track was not in use. But he said, we took the road into the interior towards the mansion, and he said it was all these trees overhanging, like you'd see in a Gothic novel, hanging over each other over the road. We drove back into the woods, and eventually the mansion came into view, and we pulled up. And we had a couple of different cars. He said he came in his car, and his buddies came in theirs. And he said it was a massive affair, ornate, sort of Italianate, Hansard roof. And they got out, and his friend showed him around the grounds, and he took them around and showed them through the mansion, which was vast. There must have been about 12 bedrooms or something like that. And there was a servant's quarters in the back, which this gentleman's friend had turned into a sort of a rec room area. He put pool tables in there and ping pong tables and maybe a couple of game machines. And there was a servant's quarters above where you could sleep if you had to put more guests elsewhere. And he took them around the grounds, and he said, "You see that clump of trees?" And my new friend said, "Yeah." He said, "Go in there, take a look." So we walked through this clump of trees and these bushes, and there was a metal door in the ground with a chain hooked through the 2 handles. And he came out, and he said, his friend said, "Did you see it?" He goes, "Yeah." "What is it?" He said, "That door leads to an underground chamber. When I bought the house, I had the chain snapped, and I opened it up, and we walked, another fellow and myself walked down these cement stairs into this underground chamber. In the middle of the room is an iron table, and there are manacles on the walls. The feeling of evil was so pervasive that I had to leave. And I closed that door, and I changed it up, and I haven't been back in there since." And he said, what do you think? He said, well, you'll find out as you walk around the place a little bit more. The people who owned it and the ones who took it over too. Evidently, in the 20s, the mansion was sold to the Italian American Hunting Club, of which all the lockers were still on the second floor in the back, with the names of the members on it, and one of them was Alfonso Capone. So evidently, these were all the mansion was bought by the mob, and because it was a wetlands, they went hunting out there, and God knows what else they did. But after having seen that room, it was believed that they brought their enemies out there and tortured them and killed them. They went in the rec room the first evening, and they got a little. They were playing pool and drinking, and he said one thing led to another, and we got a little half in the bag. The friend who was accountant said, "I'm going to go back and get some more beer." And they said, "Fine." And he left for the main house. He didn't come back for about 45 minutes. And when he came back, he was sober and he was white. And he said, "Are you okay?" He goes, "I'm not sure." He goes, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, I'm not sure if I saw what I think I saw." And he said, "Well, what did you see?" He said, "Well, when I was walking back to the house, I saw a light coming from the front, from the side of the house. So I went around, and there was a party going on in your living room on the first floor. So I sat on the lawn with my beer, and I just sat and watched it. And these people were dressed up in black and black tie, and I thought it was a costume party because it didn't look like contemporary clothing, and they were having a good time. They were drinking, and they were blowing off party favors and stuff like that, and there was confetti all over the place. Then I realized that what I was watching couldn't be happening, so I came back here. So they all went back to the house, and the house was in complete darkness. There was nothing there. He said that night, my friend said that night, he was really half in the bag. He just collapsed on his bed, and there were these long windows in each bedroom, probably about 8 feet high, from floor to ceiling. And there was a full moon out. Somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning, he was woken up by a creaking sound. He rolled over and he rubbed his eyes, and he didn't have the lights on. He looked around because there was enough moonlight coming through, and he looked in the corner and he saw the rocking chair going back and forth as if somebody was sitting in it rocking. And he turned on his side light to take a closer look, and the rocking chair stopped. And then it changed directions as if somebody had moved the chair facing him, and the chair started rocking again. He talked to his friend 2 days later, and his friend, the guy who owned the mansion, he said, "What happened to you, Dick?" And he goes, "I left." He said, "Well, I know that." He said, "What happened?" He said, "There's no way you're going to get me back in that house." And he told him what happened. He said, "Well, I thought something was wrong because when I stepped outside, your car was gone, and where your car had been, I saw a sock, a toothbrush, and a tie going in the direction of where your car was. Like you dropped all this stuff, you couldn't wait." He said, "I could not wait to get the hell away from that place." And I ran into this guy again. He told me the haunting still continues. The guy who bought the mansion was there celebrating Christmas with his family. He came down in the morning, the coffee maker was going, except it wasn't plugged in. And so they turned on a radio, for some music. They didn't have a stereo system set up. They turned on a radio for some music while they were having dinner. And all of a sudden this old music came on, like from the 20s. It started crackling, and a voice came through the radio and said, "Get out." And everybody turned their heads towards the radio. They said, "Did you hear that?" They said, "Yes." I think the fellow eventually sold the mansion because I think the happenings around there were a little bit too much for even him. But that was one of my favorite ghost stories. Another story I have before I finish up my hours when I closed the Red Lion in 2008, and I opened 4 bars for 4 other people. The first one was a brand new bar in a brand new building on Armitage here in Chicago, and the building's still there. I helped this friend of mine open it up, and I ran it for him. The building was no older than 6 months old, and it was haunted. The happenings were such that I would be by myself, and I would hear glass breaking upstairs. And I would go upstairs, and I'd check the entire place from front to back. I was the only one in the place. I'd check the entire place from front to back, and not one thing was an evidence of a broken glass or a broken window or anything like that. A friend of mine was sitting at the bar one night. He and I were talking. It was a Thursday night. We were the only ones in, and we heard a noise, and we looked over, and there were two sets of doors. There was interior double doors, and there was exterior double doors. There's a foyer in between. We saw the left front door open by itself and close, as if somebody had walked through it, opened it and closed it. It wasn't a gust of... I looked at the tablecloths, and I looked at the wires connecting the neon signs on the walls, and nothing was moving. So it wasn't wind. And he said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "What did you see?" And I said, "That door open?" I said, "Yeah." So I tore around the bar, and I ran outside, and there was nobody, not even a cat on the street. I had a couple of other incidents happen in that building, and one day my daytime bartender came up to me, and he said, "You know, it was a few months after this, he said, I had this old Gomer in here, old guy." Said, yeah, he had lunch, and he said, "Yeah, I lived here for 50 years before they tore it down and they put this place up. It was a beautiful old brownstone. The only problem with the place was it was haunted." And he told him about things that happened in the building. Hans Holzer, the famous parapsychologist and ghost hunter, said, hauntings aren't tied to the buildings necessarily. They're tied to the location. And having experienced this, and having things happen in the new Red Lion pub, I believe that. I believe that the energy is concentrated in a particular area. It's a spatial relations thing. Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish social commentator, once said, "No two sets of eyes ever saw a ghost." And I can tell you, after that incident, my friend Peter and I can refute that statement. I hope you've enjoyed the stories I've told you. These are just a few of the things I've experienced over the years, and they've led me to believe that there's so much more to this life than we know. I'm not sure whether we would characterize this as supernatural, thinking about it, or more preternatural. That what we're talking about is an area of physics, light, and vibration frequency that we just haven't found an answer to. Such as 200 years ago, we didn't have an explanation for lightning. Now we do. It's my belief that all information is in another dimension. It's prismed to us as we need it. And perhaps that's the case with our haunting tales. My name is Colin Cordwell. I'm your host. I want to thank you for sharing this time with us, and happy haunting.